Hi students, this lecture we're going to talk about unit testing and setting up our project to be unit tested and exactly what does it mean uh, to unit test. So first and foremost, what does it mean to unit test? I guess we'll go ahead and start digging at a high level what unit testing is. So unit testing is a framework to test our code and to really isolate the individual components of our code at a method level and just to test that method to ensure whatever, for example, business logic we're doing within the method uh, is correct and we're getting the correct result back from our method, or that the method is doing what we think the method is doing. And we do that for different pieces of our code that, like I already said, does that kind of business logic to ensure that, for example, maybe you work at a financial institution and you're calculating interest over a 30-year period. Maybe you want to make sure that that's correct. So you go ahead and build a unit test, do fairly simple tests with the algorithm to calculate, say, the interest rate or calculate how much money they should be making on this loan over 30 years. And you give it some parameters that you know what the final result will be, and then you actually use your program to calculate it, and you make sure that those two values end up being the same at the end of your test. So uh, chapter 14, that's what the second part of chapter 14 covers after dependency injection. So if we go here and cycle through past the dependency injection portion, you can see um, the unit testing process here in this slide. So you see we code a test method to call methods of the other classes. So essentially we're going to call the methods inside of our web project. So we're going to have a project we're going to use to unit test. It'll be our unit test project. Usually you name it such as your main project uh, and then .tests or .test or something like that, which we'll go over here in a minute when I go ahead and install it in my project. Then you execute that test or all of the tests to verify that your code works correctly or as you coded it. And if it does work correctly, you can continue on coding. And if it doesn't work correctly, you can go back to that method and figure out why. So um, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. You can either go through and unit test all of the code that you've written at the end, um, or another popular way to do it is you can do test-driven development or TDD, where you can first write the test and then you code your method to pass that test, and then you don't finish coding that method until the test passes, and then you go on and do that until your project is finished. So one method is you code the project and then code your tests, and then you then fine-tune your methods, or you code the test first, and then you don't move on until that method passes or that test passes. So you see here, you debug and fix the code that causes test methods to fail. Here's some advantages of unit testing. It reduces the amount of time you have to spend manually testing. So if you're in the testing phase of your project and you've done a bunch of unit tests already, you already know that the bulk of your code works that you've already unit tested. It makes it easy to test an app after a significant code change. So if you already have unit tests and then you make a new feature of your application and you write another test for it, whenever you check it in, as long as all the tests passes, you should never have broken any part of your code because you've had those unit tests written. So you should never have any collateral damage whenever you go and something goes into production and it doesn't work, because you have all of those unit tests that proved that everything worked before you deployed that new feature or whatever you have to production. So there's multiple testing frameworks. The one that they use in the book is xUnit, which is it's used in .NET Core. I guess NUnit for the longest time didn't work in .NET Core. I think it now does in 3.1. MS Test is another popular one. And xUnit is kind of newer, and it's also built by somebody at Microsoft. So xUnit is what they chose to use for this chapter in the book. So whenever we do go ahead and add our xUnit project into the mix, we need to then add a reference to the project in our tests back to that main project. So you can see we have bookstore.tests. So here's our test project to make sure we're coding all of those methods inside of the bookstore, which is our web application in the book. I'm not going to use the bookstore project, but this just uses the bookstore as an example. And you see we go into the dependencies inside Visual Studio inside of the Solution Explorer, and then we can add a reference to the bookstore project. That way we can see all of the classes within the bookstore project, and we have access to calling those classes. And here are some static classes of the assert class, which we'll get into when we go to code our unit tests. So let's go ahead and add the project to our solution and go ahead and code that reference. So we've already looked at how to do the reference in Visual Studio, so I'm going to do it in Visual Studio Code since it's a little bit more, I won't say work, but it's a little bit more command line interface driven versus UI driven. Let's go ahead and exit out of this. Here is the xUnit test homepage. So all of the documentation about xUnit is here. If you need to figure out how to write unit tests, or there's a lot you can do with unit tests. So any methods that you can call, maybe you want to unit test a particular function or functionality of your application that we don't cover in these videos. Make sure you go to xunit.github.io, and you have all of the getting started documentation. Even for, it's mainly .NET, but whatever else you might be doing here. So Xamarin, Universal Windows Apps, .NET Framework, .NET Core, etc., etc. All that can be found on xUnit's website. So that being said, let's go ahead and I'm going to open my application. You can see that I don't currently have an xUnit for test project here. So what I can do is I can go to my terminal in the .NET CLI. I can then go to .NET new, and then I can go -- help because I'm going to want to add a new project to my solution. And let's see if they have a template for the project I'm looking for. So if I scroll up here, here's all the templates that the .NET Framework gives me. You can see I have the NUnit units here. I have the MS test project here, and I have my xUnit test project. So all of these are different testing frameworks I can use. And I'm going to then choose the xUnit test project. So I should be able to simply say .NET new xUnit, and then it should generate that template inside of this solution. So let me go ahead. Where am I at? I'm at Core Apps. All right, so I might need to make a new directory first to put this in. So let's go ahead and go back to a directory. All right, so let's go back to where I was just at. Let's go ahead and make directory .2.tests. And then let's go ahead and cd into that. Should be an empty directory. And then let's go ahead and do .NET new xUnit. And it should create that test project. The template xUnit test project was created successfully. Restore succeeded, so then it goes ahead and restores all of the NuGet packages, and you can see here that I have a new folder with a new test project inside of my solution here. So now I have my database project, my entities project, my interfaces project, my proxy project, and my repository project, and my actual web application here, which is my MVC application. So here's the CS_proj file that goes along with that. You can see that it has xUnit and all of the packages that I need to have installed already inside of it. I can then go to unit test 1, which shows me exactly It gives me a little bit of a template of a test I can run. You can see we use fact, which essentially is a method we can test that doesn't have parameters. A method that does have parameters we would call a theory, so we can then come here and say public. Tests are always void since they don't return anything. It's simply going to assert true or false. And we can then give it a name. Right now we'll just say test2. We'll give it a name here in a second when we actually code the test. And then we can say theory. And a theory is a test that the method has some sort of parameters. So string param1, string, or maybe int param1, int param2. And then from there we can give it some data. So we can say inline data, and then we can give it 5, 6, and then it should match up with each one of our then parameters. Okay, so then we would typically rename this unit test.cs. We can name it, usually it's by class, but since I don't have a class right now, I'll just call it Diablo2 tests.cs, and then I'll go ahead and rename this as well. And the last thing we need to do is make a reference to this main project. We can really make a reference to any one of these projects that we need to test. Let's go ahead and make a reference to our main project here. So let's go ahead and go back to the terminal. If you're in Visual Studio, remember you can simply right-click your dependencies and add a dependency to this main project. Or I can say .NET add. Let's go ahead and find my test.cs proj. And I'm going to say reference to, I might need to go back. So I might need to say // // So let's see, one // takes me to where? Should take me to here. So I might not need two. I think this is where I want to be. Okay. Okay, I added the reference, so now I should go back to my CS proj and it should be there. Okay, so now I have a project reference and I'm looking at my com.diablo2 project there. So now I should be able to go back to my tests and I should be able to say, let's go to controllers, items controllers. Now I should be able to say items controller equals new items controller. Let's go ahead and copy this. Let's close some of this stuff. And my items controller probably takes in my repository class. So I might also need a reference to this repository for this to work. I'm not currently getting any errors. I'm sure I have errors here, so let me go ahead and I believe I might need to restart my OmniSharp. So let's go ahead and do that. Did it restart? Let's go ahead and try to build this project here. Let me go back. Let's go .NET build. Why am I not seeing? There we go. So that succeeded. Let's try to then build my test project. So let's go to directory, cd into my test project. Directory cd com.diablo2.tests. What am I doing wrong here? There it went. What was, oh, I don't think I put the 2. Okay. All right, now that I'm here, let's do a .NET build. Okay, it looks like I'm getting errors now, like I thought I should have been the whole time. So let's go ahead and try to restart OmniSharp now. Still doesn't look like it wants to restart OmniSharp. I might need to close VS Code and reopen it. So let me close VS Code and reopen it, and I'll come back. Okay, I was able to get my project up and running. I had to do a few things. I had to first add my project to the solution, as I don't think I ever did that. So if we go to my solution file, here it is. We can see that I added my project to the solution file, which you shouldn't have an issue with if you're in Visual Studio. I only had an issue in Visual Studio Code because it's a glorified text editor essentially. So when I added the project into my solution or into this folder, I never put it in this. I never actually tied it to this entire solution. So that was one reason I wasn't getting any errors. And then once I put it in my solution and restarted OmniSharp, then I started getting all of the things I was expecting. So I also did a few other things to set us up that I'll explain a little bit now, and then in the next video we'll start getting into how to set up a unit test. So the first thing I did was I made a new items controller, and when you look at items controller, it requires a lot of things that I ended up needing to make a reference to pretty much all of the projects in my solution, because the items controller requires all of those things. So the items controller requires a repository. So I passed it a repository. If we come over back to my tests, we can see I passed my items controller my repository. So I needed to then include a reference to my repository so it knew where that class existed, in which namespace. Then the repository required a proxy, so then I had to include the proxy project as well in the dependency section of my CSproj file. So if we look here, I have all of my projects listed as references now in my tests project. And then I also required a context to my database as well, which then, whenever I made a new one of these, it required the options to the database, so where the connection string existed and stuff like that. Since I just gave it new context options, it's not actually going to reach out to my database, so I'll probably end up changing this because it's never actually going to work, and it shouldn't really work because this should just test the functionality of my web application and not necessarily the functionality of the integrations or the functionality of my database. Um, and then I also have a mapper, and I use mock to do it, which we'll talk about in the next video what this line of code is. So that's setting up xUnit inside of your solution, and then tying all of those pieces together to your tests project so you're able to set up classes. So in the next video, we'll talk about how we're going to use our new xUnit project to create a couple of unit tests. So I'll see you guys there. Thanks.